This is a 2000 Ford Mustang SVT Cobra R, and it's a seriously special car. This came out at the tail end of the 1990s, and it was the ultimate Mustang they made back then, and there were only 300 total units of production. This is one of the rare 300, and today I'm going to give it a full review and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this SVT Cobra R is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a very special car, and 32,000 miles lifetime in California and very few modifications, which is rare for a Cobra R, and it can be yours on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this SVT Cobra R, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Alright, time for the quirks and features of the Cobra R. But before I get into the little stuff, I want to give you a general overview of exactly what this car is. Because you see the big wing, and maybe you haven't heard of this, you're thinking, is this something that some kid modded? No, couldn't be further from the truth. So here's the deal. Back in the 90s, the Mustang lineup didn't have as many special versions and high performance models as it has now. You basically had a base model V6 Mustang and then a V8 Mustang, which was called the GT, and then you had the Cobra, which was like the high performance model at the top of the lineup, and then you had small little flashes of Ford making the high performance Cobra R. They did it 3 separate times. There was a 1993 Cobra R, there was a 95 Cobra R, and then there was this, the 2000 SVT Cobra R, which is the best known of all 3 of them, probably because of its giant distinctive rear spoiler, and because it is just so damn cool. So what exactly did the Cobra R have that made it so cool? Well, it was all about performance in basically every facet of this vehicle, and I'm going to start with the powertrain. This was a naturally aspirated V8 that made 385 horsepower and 385 pound-feet of torque. Those were huge numbers back in 2000. Ferrari was just coming out with the 360, their entry-level supercar, and this was barely behind that on horsepower, and it had even more torque. Today's entry-level Ferrari supercar has over 700 horsepower, so the modern Mustang equivalent would be the Shelby GT500. But this was even more special, in part because it was simply rarer. Only 300 of these were made, like I said. Total production run for the whole world. This is number 268. Now, this car was also special because it came at kind of a dark time in terms of Ford Mustang Cobra performance. You see, in 1999, Ford came out with a new Mustang Cobra, and they were touting it had 320 horsepower, but people put them on dynos and discovered they didn't really have 320 horsepower. The 99 Cobras weren't making the advertised horsepower or torque figures, and acceleration was pretty lackluster as well. There was a huge controversy over this. Lawsuits. Ford had to stop the sale of the 99 Cobra. They were totally embarrassed and ashamed that their Halo performance car had been called out like this and wasn't what it was described. And so they pulled it off the market for the 2000 model year entirely. This came out in 2000 and added some credibility back to the Cobra name after that very dark period in 99 where the Mustang Cobra was frankly a huge disappointment. And it wasn't until 2003 when Ford came out with the Terminator Mustang Cobra with its supercharged V8 with 390 horsepower, so they said, but really it was a lot more. It wasn't until then that Ford finally kind of earned back the trust and the excitement of Mustang fans and enthusiasts. This car was sort of the lone bright spot in a tough time for Mustang performance. But as cool as the Terminator Cobra was, this car, the 2000 Cobra R, was frankly a lot cooler for a lot of reasons. The low production number is one of them. Like I said, 300 units is incredibly rare, but it was more than just that. This car wasn't just about power. It had extensive upgrades all throughout the car to make it kind of the ultimate performance Mustang. And the goal wasn't just performance in a straight line. Ford really wanted to enhance this and make it the ultimate racetrack-focused Mustang, which was a totally new concept for the Mustang at the time. But Ford really committed to it, and they upgraded this car everywhere, not just in the engine for straight-line acceleration. One good example is weight savings. Ford took out a lot of stuff that weighed down the Mustang to make it lighter to throw it around a racetrack. These cars did not come with air conditioning. No air conditioning in the SVT Cobra R. You can see it has a fan that you can turn on, but you don't have the AC unit, AC compressor, all that stuff added weight. These cars didn't come with cruise control, which other Mustang models did, but you didn't get it in the Cobra R. These cars didn't come with a radio, although one has been added back to this Cobra R aftermarket. But from the factory, a radio was not available. And these Cobra R models didn't even come with back seats. All the other Mustangs had back seats. In this car, they were removed, gone, two-seater only. The back seats just added weight, and they weren't necessary. Now, there are a lot of lightweight Porsche models out there where they also remove all this stuff, but you can add them all back in as options, and almost everyone does to enhance your comfort. Not this car. None of this stuff was available. You couldn't get air conditioning. You couldn't get a radio. You couldn't get back seats. It wasn't even available as an option. This was a totally stripped-down car, and the focus was weight savings and maximum track performance. In fact, you go into the trunk, and you can see they didn't even bother with a trunk liner. You have the spare tire just sitting there, and then this sort of crappy painted surface. That's the inside of the trunk. No trunk liner, again, to save weight. Now, you do have some stereo components in here for the aftermarket stereo that was added later, but regular Cobra R models wouldn't have even had that. Just a spare tire and kind of a crappy looking trunk with no carpet to save weight. And another way that Ford showed they were serious about racetrack performance in the Cobra R, moving back inside, was the seats. You can see these sport bucket seats, racing seats that have holes for a racing harness in the top. And in this car, a racing harness has been added to go along with its ethos and purpose as a track car. The standard Mustang seats were deemed not good enough, and you got these Recaro racing bucket seats instead. And they also had the cool Cobra R logo on them, with an R and a Cobra sort of intermingled to again show this was the special model. And the upgrades didn't stop there. This car came with Brembo brakes, which was a big deal for a Mustang, again proving they were thinking about more than just going fast in a straight line. Stopping was also on their mind. Front brake rotors were 13 inches, which was pretty big for 2000. You also had a massive front splitter, which was intended to improve aerodynamics, airflow, downforce. It was huge. It's what like serious racetrack performance cars have, and the Cobra R has it too. Now, this front splitter was removable. It was very low, and so you could take it off if you wanted to clear steep angled driveways, that sort of thing, but it's very cool to see it in place, and it helped contribute to the distinctive look of this car. Also worth pointing out, that front splitter front fascia area normally included fog lights on Mustang models like this, but in the Cobra R they were removed in order to use this space for brake cooling ducts. You can see fog lights gone, you got a duct instead that brings air to the brakes to cool them down, which would have helped for racetrack performance. And beyond that, you had upgraded suspension in the Cobra R. Again, not just a straight line car, they put in I-box springs and sport suspension to make the car steer and handle better than, well, any Mustang before it. Same deal with the transmission. You had a Tremex 6-speed close ratio transmission. The goal was great acceleration on racetracks, not necessarily just at the drag strip going in a straight line. The car was really extensively transformed from what people knew a Mustang was at the time. And by the way, another upgrade, and probably the most obvious exterior change to the Cobra R, came in back, the giant rear wing. You can see mounted on the trunk, absolutely huge. This isn't some aftermarket modification, though it sort of looks like one. This was factory, and it was a distinctive touch to the Cobra Rs. Presumably, it added downforce, and it certainly added a lot to this car's look to make it seem like a much more serious, much more track-focused, much more special Mustang. And there was more. This car also had some really cool cosmetic improvements beyond the stuff that actually mattered to help it stand out from regular Mustang models and to give it a cool look. One of my very favorites is the wheels. These wheels were distinctive distinctive to the Cobra R. They weren't on any of the other models, and you can see the center cap is especially cool. You have this R logo with the letter R and then the Cobra sort of intertwined between it. It is a very cool touch and a very subtle little detail. Less subtle is the hood, which you can see is absolutely massive. It has what they called a power dome, a huge multi-inch rise from the hood in order to make room for the massive engine that lays underneath. This massive, excessive hood bulge, very cool and very distinctive and unique to the Cobra R. Now, if you're wondering whether the hood bulge is necessary, the answer is actually yes, it is. You open up the hood and you can see this massive intake that says Cobra R going all the way down it. It looks cool, it's huge, again, distinctive, very neat when you open up the hood just to see that. And sitting on top of the engine there, it did require extra clearance, hence the hood bulge. And speaking of the clearance for this part, here's something amazing. If you look on the inside under the hood, you can see there's one support bar on one side and none over on the other side. That's because the engine was large enough that it wouldn't have had room to fit under the two support bars that are on all of the other Mustang hoods. And so Ford decided that their solution to this problem would be to simply remove one of the support bars, pretty much just cut it off and leave it without that. It wasn't really necessary, and so it doesn't have it, and that side is removed. The owner told me this is a great way to spot fake Cobra Rs, or at least fake Cobra R hoods, because they never really cut it just like Ford did to remove that bar to clear the engine. A funny piece of Cobra R lore. But that little detail, the removed support arm under the hood, is not the quirkiest detail of the Mustang Cobra R. That honor, the quirkiest, goes to the rear bumper, which is from a Mustang V6. That's strange because you had the Mustang GT, the V8 model with a more aggressive rear bumper, the Cobra, more special, more performance-y, and yet the Cobra R, the top model, used the bumper from the base level rental car spec cheap crappy Mustang V6. Why did they do that? Well, you see, the Cobra R has a fuel cell, which was a benefit on the racetrack, but when they put the fuel cell in back here, the exhaust couldn't clear it in order to come out the rear bumper. And so all SVT Cobra R models have a side exhaust. You can see exhaust pipes on both sides, which is really cool, driver and passenger quad pipes, but on two different sides of the car. But it didn't have a rear exhaust, and that's important because the V8 Mustang models from this era had little cutouts in the bumper where a dual exhaust was supposed to be. And on all the V8 cars, you had the exhaust pipes there and it looked cool, but the Cobra R didn't have an exhaust there, and it would have looked stupid just to have the cutouts and no exhaust. The V6 Mustang bumper didn't have any cutouts, so that was used instead. And that's why you have this massive, aggressive front splitter and big rear spoiler, and yet the base model V6 rear bumper. Kind of an interesting quirk. Also worth pointing out, another interesting exterior quirk in this car, there's no antenna because these didn't come with a radio, so they didn't need an antenna, but Ford didn't make any Mustang front fenders without a hole for an antenna. So the Cobra R models have this little plastic patch that goes over the hole where the antenna should be, because all the other Mustang models had an antenna there. Also, one other cool cosmetic touch the SVT Cobra R had, headlights, blacked out headlights. As you can see, very cool, very sinister looking, and it was unique to the Cobra R, although unfortunately later stolen and added to other Mustang models in the model line, but it first came out here and it looked very cool. Now, in terms of cosmetics with this car, worth pointing out that all 300 of these SVT Cobra R models were this color scheme, which was performance red, they called the exterior, with this sort of gray black, I think they called it charcoal interior. They were all this color, no exceptions. Also worth pointing out that badging on the outside of this car was relatively subtle. You had the little R in the wheels like I showed you, and you had a little Cobra badge on the front fenders, as you can see, and you had SVT on the trunk lid, but that was pretty much it. It never actually says Cobra R or SVT Cobra R. Those words don't appear anywhere on the outside of this car. It was one of those vehicles where you just had to know in order to know. Otherwise, you probably thought some dude just put a big hood and a big wing on his V6 Mustang based on the rear bumper. But anyway, next up, moving inside the Cobra R, you got in here and you quickly discovered that this interior was very Mustang. And in the late 90s, that was absolutely not a compliment. I already showed you the seats, the cool seats, which are indeed cool, and the cool special Tremex 6-speed manual transmission. Beyond that, you also had Cobra on the steering wheel, which I guess was kind of cool, and you had special floor mats that say Cobra, as you can see, driver side Cobra, passenger side Cobra, but that was pretty much it. The rest of this interior was 90s Mustang, and it wasn't good. I tell you, it's really a hodgepodge of crappy materials, bad plastics, cheap stuff, and massive panel gaps all throughout this interior. You sit in here and you look around and it just doesn't look nice or even anything approaching nice. There are all sorts of cheap gray panels and plastics that sit next to other cheap gray panels, but they're not the same gray. They don't match up, and Ford looks stupid. Couldn't even get panels in their interiors to match up. You can see 3 different shades of gray right here on the dashboard. You also had some horrible panel fitment, like when the dashboard meets the center console, this big panel gap line in the center, which really drew attention to the bad fitment of this piece. You had a similar thing over on the passenger side of the dashboard where that intersects with the door panel. Again, a massive panel gap. Modern automakers do so much better here, or frankly, just any automaker that cares, but that wasn't really the goal of this car. Just a lot of cheap stuff all throughout this interior. It frankly looked like a cheap kind of rental-y car interior in this era of Mustang, including the Cobra R. But the thing that's important to keep in mind about this car is that didn't really matter, and frankly, it still doesn't. The point of this car was not to have a high luxury interior with nice materials and wood and carbon fiber and blah, blah, blah. This car was about cheap speed. Back in 2000, it cost 54 grand for 385 horsepower. That was a bargain then, and frankly, it still is. And it didn't matter if you got into this car and you looked at the cheap center console and the rental car spec cup holder and this cheap crappy plastic dashboard, because you were sitting on a racing seat and looking out over that power dome and you were about to go fast. And that's all you cared about. The interior was absolutely an afterthought. Overall, this car was just a damn good deal, especially with the low production figures and all the other special upgrades made to this car. And speaking of the low production numbers, here's something very cool. All SVT Cobra R models were offered with this black binder. You open up the black binder and you can see a plaque that specifically identifies this exact car as number 268 of 300, like I said earlier. Interestingly, these black binders were not given away when the cars were sold new. Instead, you would buy the car from the dealership, and once you got your registration, you would send a proof of that into Ford, and only then would they send you the black binder. But of course, some people never bothered to send in their registration slip to Ford in order to get their black book when they bought the car new. And the owner of this car told me that to this day, there are still people on the forums for this car who buy one of these, it doesn't come with the black book, and they send in a copy of their registration to Ford, and they get their black book back from Ford because it had never been claimed by the original owner or owners. Apparently there's some room in Dearborn sitting there with a few of these Cobra R black books left, ready for claimant. But for this car, it does come with it, and it has that cool plaque, which is neat to see. And opening up the black book further, you have a certificate of authenticity that shows your VIN, and again gives you like your production number and the lineup, and it's signed by some Ford bigwigs. And then the rest of the black book kind of shows like how the car was made and the history of the car and why it's special and various other Cobra R things. And so it's a neat little memento to have with the Cobra R. All right, driving the SVT Cobra R. And the first thing that comes to mind is this car is pretty intense. So my first and only experience with the Cobra R is playing Gran Turismo, where this car is portrayed as being like almost uncontrollable. Just like a ton of power and constant oversteer. And I'm driving it now, and it's an intense car. It does not feel like any other new edge Mustang I've ever been in, including a Terminator Cobra, and I've been in a lot of them. So what exactly do I mean? Well, there's a lot of stuff that just isn't I mean, you can hear a lot of creaking and rattling, a lot of exhaust, a lot of tire. When you push the clutch in, you can hear it. Rear suspension, there's no sound deadening anywhere in this car. It feels like an exotic sports car with like everything removed and, you know, carbon chassis almost. Like it's amazing to me how much more raw this car feels than a regular Mustang from this era. And then there's the exhaust. This feels like the ultimate modern muscle car, which to an extent it kind of was, except that theoretically it could turn, but you rev it. Oh, that's a big V8. There's no forced induction happening here. This is just V8 power. Oh. That's foot to the floor. I don't want to be like a Mustang guy who gets sideways, but this car is quick. Man, it's buzzy, and it reminds me of an exotic sports car. It's buzzy, it's rattly, stuff is removed. Like, this car is stripped down bare bones. And you're looking out over that huge power dome. Ugh, you just feel muscly. You feel more like, Rrr. I really, like, legitimately feel like I'm like some muscle car dude. Oh. Man, the powertrain is just a big engine. I mean, it's just big V8 power. Again, no forced induction, which even by 2000 was pretty rare if you wanted to get a lot of power out of a V8. A lot of people, including Ford, were doing supercharged V8s. Not this car. It just has power. And so it feels like a big engine up there, which is exactly what it is. The clutch is surprisingly heavy, and again, you can hear it, you can feel it, very raw feeling. Rev matching is pretty easy though. You can rev up the powertrain quite quickly, and the transmission in these new age Mustangs was actually surprisingly good. The Tremec, it felt good, it felt nice going into gear, relatively short throws, didn't have a lot of like wobbling around. You really kind of felt like you knew what you were doing and you were in a performance car with this manual transmission. Of course, then you press the turn signal stalk and you feel like you're in a 1997 Ford Aerostar. Man, this car just feels so much more raw and so much more serious than a regular Cobra or Mustang from this era. You know, it's funny, I reviewed a Terminator Cobra maybe 6 months ago, and I was looking at the specs for the Cobra R, and I was thinking to myself, I bet this is gonna feel a lot like a Terminator. You know, Terminator came later. I bet the Cobra R kind of got superseded by it. I don't feel like that now. This car is a lot different from a Terminator. Terminator is far more like rational and usable on the road. It was big powered, it was a lot of fun, but this car just feels like it's kind of compromised, but in a cool way, in like a Porsche GT3 kind of way. Now, like I said before, this was the Mustang that handled, or so they said. So you're probably curious, how does it handle? The answer is not all that great. It handles better than any other American car from this era. I've done F-bodies, I've done the Terminator Cobra, a lot of American cars from this era. I owned a Viper. Honestly, this feels about like that, maybe even a little better. It handles better than you would expect a car like this to handle, a muscle car from the early 2000s, late 90s. But ultimately, hate to say it, still a Mustang and still a 22-year-old car. You know, you get into a 2000 BMW M3, and even that doesn't, by modern standards, doesn't quite have the handling capabilities of some cars. God, it's a muscle car. But the steering is pretty good. It's actually fairly quick steering. You do have on-center vagueness that's annoying, but that American car companies just couldn't seem to get rid of in this era. It just wasn't gonna happen. Overall, I am quite impressed with the Cobra R, actually. This car is not a new age Mustang with a few mods. This was a comprehensively upgraded car. It looked like that when I was reading all the details about it, but it actually feels like that too. This car is raw, it's brutal, it's fast, it's cool looking, and I think this is an awesome car. I'm a huge Terminator Cobra fan. I love that car, but I think this car is more special, more like exciting and cool and unique, and it definitely feels less like a regular Mustang than almost any other Mustang I've ever been in. It feels like a totally different experience. Again, almost like a true exotic sports car. And so that's the 2000 Ford Mustang SVT Cobra R. This car was a bright spot in the Mustang lineup at the end of the 1990s. It's very cool, very limited production, and I have always wanted to check one out, but they're so rare, I don't even remember the last time I saw one. I'm thrilled that I had the chance to review this Cobra R, and it can be yours on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Cobra R a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 49 out of 100, which places the SVT Cobra R here against other similar vehicles. It's dead last, but in the best way possible. The Cobra R earns a 33 in the weekend categories, which is a huge number that ties some greats, like the Dodge Viper and Honda S2000 CR. Where it falls apart is the daily categories, but that makes sense. This car has no air conditioning, no back seats, no factory radio. It's not supposed to be a good daily car, and well, it isn't. But it's an absolute hoot, and it's more exciting than I expected.